A Child's History of the World. Chapter 6. The Puzzle Writers. People of the Stone Age had learned how to talk to each other, but they could not write, for there was no such thing as an alphabet or written words, and so they could not send notes or messages to one another or write stories. The Egyptians were the first people to think of a way to write what they wanted to say. The Egyptians did not write with letters like ours, but with signs that looked like little pictures: a lion, a spear, a bird, a whip. This picture writing was called hieroglyphics. See if you can say hieroglyphics. Perhaps you've seen stories written in pictures in the puzzle section of a newspaper. Hieroglyphics were something like that. One example is the name of an Egyptian queen you'll hear more about later: Cleopatra. In hieroglyphics, her name looked completely different from how we spell it today. A king's or queen's name was always enclosed in a special line called a cartouche to mark it as important, kind of like the monogram your mother might put inside a decorative border on her stationery. But there was no paper in those days, and so the Egyptians wrote on the leaves of a plant called papyrus that grew in the water. It is from this name, papyrus, that we get the name paper. Can you see that paper and papyrus look and sound something alike? The Egyptians' books were written by hand, of course, but they had no pencils, nor pens, nor ink to write with. For a pen they used a reed, split at the end, and for ink a mixture of water and soot. Their books were not made of separate pages like our books, but from a long sheet of papyrus leaves pasted together. This was rolled up to form what was called a scroll, something like a roll of wallpaper, and was read as it was unrolled. Stories of their kings and battles and great events in their history they used to write on the walls of their buildings and monuments. This writing they carved into the stone, so that it would last much longer than that on the papyrus leaves. All the old Egyptians who wrote in hieroglyphics and knew how to read this writing had died long since, and for a great many years no one knew what such writing meant. But a little over 100 years ago, a man found out by accident how to read and understand hieroglyphics once again. This is the way he happened to do so. The Nile separates into different streams before it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. These separate streams are called mouths, and one of these mouths has been given the name Rosetta. One day, a man was digging nearby this Rosetta mouth when he dug up a stone, something like a tombstone, with several kinds of writing on it. The top writing was in pictures which we now call hieroglyphics, and no one understood what it meant. Below this was written what was supposed to be the same story in the Greek language, and a great many people do understand Greek. All one had to do, therefore, to find out the meaning of the hieroglyphics was to compare the two writings. It was like reading secret writing when we know what the letters stand for. You may have tried to solve a puzzle in the back of your magazine, and this was just such an interesting puzzle, only there was no one to tell the answer in the next number. The puzzle was not so easy as it sounds, however, for it took a man almost 20 years to solve it. That is a long time for anyone to spend in trying to solve a puzzle, isn't it? But after this key to the puzzle was found, men were able to read all of the hieroglyphics in Egypt, and so to find out what happened in that country long before Christ was born. This stone is called the Rosetta Stone, from the Rosetta mouth of the Nile where it was found. It is now in the Great British Museum in London and is very famous, because from it we were able to learn so much history which we otherwise would not have known. Egypt was ruled over by a king who was called a pharaoh. When he died, his son became the pharaoh, and so on. All the other people were divided into classes, and the children in each class usually became just what their fathers had been. It was very unusual for an Egyptian to start at the bottom and work up to the top. as a poor boy in this country may do, though once in a great while this happened even in Egypt, as we shall see by and by. The highest class of people were called priests. They were not like priests or ministers of the church nowadays, however, for there was no church at that time. The priests made the religion and rules, which everyone had to obey as everybody does the laws of our land. But the priests were not only priests, they were doctors and lawyers and engineers as well. They were the best educated class, and they were the only people who knew how to read and write. For it was very difficult, as you might suppose, to learn how to read and write hieroglyphics. The next highest class to the priests were the soldiers, and below these were the lower classes: farmers, shepherds, shopkeepers, merchants, mechanics, and last of all, the swineherds. The Egyptians did not worship one god as we do. They believed in hundreds of gods and goddesses, and they had a special god for every sort of thing, who ruled over and had charge of that thing. A god of the farm, a god of the home, and so on. Some of their gods were good, and some were bad, but the Egyptians prayed to them all. Osiris was the chief god, and Isis was his wife. Osiris was the god of farming and judge of the dead. Their son Horus had the head of a hawk. Many of their gods had bodies of men with heads of animals. Animals they thought sacred. The dog and the cat were sacred animals. The ibis, which was a bird like a stork, was another. Then there was the beetle, which was called a scarab. If anyone killed a sacred animal, he was put to death. For the Egyptians thought it much worse to kill a sacred and holy creature than to kill even a human being.